Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for tuning into a new episode of Rock and Read. Today we will pick up where we left off with Chapter 13 of Heavier Than Heaven, the Kurt Cobain biography by Charles R. Cross. Chapter 13 is called Smells Like Teen Spirit. Here we go. Heroine. Kurt's own interpretation of the word heroin had first appeared back in his rude cartoons in 8th grade. Having grown up fascinated by rock and roll, he was well aware that many of the musicians he idolized had succumbed to drug abuse. And though he had addictively smoked pot, drank too much, and was known to huff inhalant from the bottoms of shaving cream cans, he pledged that he would never suffer a similar fate. In 1987, during one of Kurt's sober purging periods, he chastised Jesse Reed when his friend suggested they try heroin. Kurt wouldn't hang out with me after that, Jesse remembered. I was trying to find heroin, a drug I'd never tried and he'd never tried, and he would lecture me. Why do you want to? Why do you want to so badly? In a personal drug history constructed later in life, Kurt wrote that he had first used it in Aberdeen in the late 80s. His friends contest this, since he had a fear of needles at the time, and there was no heroin to be found in his circle. He did occasionally take Percodan in Aberdeen, a prescription narcotic. He may have romanticized and exaggerated this opiate when recalling it later. By the fall of 1990, broken-hearted over Toby, the same questions Kurt asked of Jesse earlier could have been put to him. In early November, he overcame his fear of needles and first injected heroin with a friend in Olympia. He found that the drug's euphoric effects helped him temporarily escape his heartache and his stomach pain. The next day, Kurt phoned Chris. Hey Chris, I did heroin, Kurt told his friend. Wow, what was that like? Chris asked. Kurt said, no, it was alright. Chris then told him, you shouldn't do it. Look at Andy Wood. Wood was the lead singer of Mother Love Bone, an up-and-coming Seattle band, who died of a heroin overdose in March 1990. Novoselic cited other Olympia friends who had died of heroin addiction. Kurt's reply? Yeah, I know. Novoselic, playing the role of older brother, warned Kurt that it wasn't like other drugs he had done. I remember literally telling him that he was playing with dynamite. But the warning fell on deaf ears. Though Kurt promised Chris he wouldn't try the drug again, he broke this promise. To avoid Chris or Grohl finding out, Kurt used the drug at friends' houses. He found a dealer named Jose, who was selling to many of the greeners in Olympia. Coincidentally, Dylan Carlson had experimented with heroin for the first time that fall, though not with Kurt. But soon, their bonding also extended to heroin. Usually done only once a week, owing to several factors, including their poverty and their desire to not become addicts. But they would go on occasional binges, like the time they rented a cheap hotel room in Seattle to nod off in private without alarming their friends or roommates. But Kurt's friends were alarmed by his drug use. Tracy had finally forgiven Kurt, and they were occasionally hanging out. When Shelley told her Kurt was doing heroin, she couldn't believe her ears. That week, Kurt phoned Tracy late at night, obviously high, and she challenged him directly. He told me he had done it a few times. He said he really liked it, and that it made him more sociable. But he said he wasn't going to do it all the time. I tried to walk the fine line by telling him he shouldn't do it without making him feel bad for having done it. A week later, they spent an evening together attending several parties. In between events, Kurt insisted they stop by his place so he could use the toilet. When he didn't return, Tracy went looking and found him on the floor with a bottle of bleach sitting next to him and a needle in his arm. She was furious. Kurt had turned into something Tracy couldn't have imagined in her worst nightmare. The joke of Nirvana's first album title no longer seemed funny to anyone. But heroin was only a small part of 1990 for Kurt, and for the most part, he kept his promise to use it only occasionally. He was distracted from all else by the fact that his career was taking off like never before. He signed a contract in the fall with Virgin Publishing, which brought him his first big check. Kaz, president of Virgin, flew to the Northwest to ink the deal. Though Kaz was a longtime industry veteran and had worked with everyone from The Clash to Queen, he was shocked to see the squalor of Kurt's apartment. They talked about Kurt's influences, particularly The Clash. Kurt said Sandinista was one of the first records he owned that was remotely punk. Kurt's initial share of the publishing deal came in the form of a check for $3,000. He paid his rent and then drove to South Sound Mall with Mikey Nelson and Joe Preston. Kurt spent almost $1,000 in Toys R Us on a Nintendo system, 2 Pixelvision video cameras, 2 automatic BB guns that look like M16 rifles, and several Evel Knievel plastic models. He also bought fake dog feces, fake vomit, and rubber severed hands. He threw it all into a basket, remembered Preston. It was just a bunch of junk he could destroy. It was as if an 8-year-old boy had been set loose in the store and told he could have anything he wanted. Kurt used the BB gun to immediately shoot out the windows on the Washington State Lottery building across the street. He also bought, for $20, a used child swinger bicycle, a style that at the time was remarkably unhip. It was so tiny that pedaling it required him to scrunch over with his knees to his shoulders. Kurt gleefully rode the bike until it was dark. He was still riding the bike a few days later in the midst of what at the time was the most important business meeting he had ever had. On Thurston Moore's recommendation, the band had contacted Gold Mountain Management. The firm was run by Danny Goldberg and John Silva. Silva, as the younger manager, was assigned the job of negotiating with Nirvana. It was an easy task. Because of his connection with Sonic Youth, he already had Kurt's stamp of approval. Silva and his girlfriend Lisa Fancher came to Seattle to meet the band face-to-face and take them to dinner. Kurt loved being taken to dinner by music industry honchos because it was the only way he could guarantee eating a decent meal. But this night, Silva and the rest of the band sat around for hours while Kurt rode his swinger bike in a circle in the lottery parking lot. We all decided he was going to break a limb. Though the long delay seemed like just another childish pastime, a more cynical observer might have suggested it was Kurt's first move in what would become a battle of wills with his soon-to-be manager. Kurt put his bicycle down to go to dinner, but afterward announced Beat Happening was playing across town. It was a test of Silva's interest, and like any good businessman, Silva acted enthused and went to the show with Kurt. Silva protested to Fancher later that he detested Calvin's band. She also remembered he initially hated Sonic Youth, complaining about their major egos. Yet he had passed Kurt's acid test, and within the week, Nirvana had signed with Gold Mountain. On November 25th, Nirvana played a show at Seattle's Off-Ramp that attracted more A&R representatives than any concert in Northwest history. Representatives from Columbia, Capitol, Slash, RCA, and several other labels were bumping into each other. The A&R guys were in full court press, observed Sony's Damon Stewart. The sheer number of A&R reps altered the way the band was perceived in Seattle. By that time, explained Susan Silver, there was a competitive feeding frenzy going on around them. The show itself was remarkable. Kurt later told a friend it was his favorite Nirvana performance. During an 18-song set, the band played 12 unreleased tunes. They opened with a powerful Aneurysm. the first time it was played in public, and the crowd slam danced and body surfed until they broke the light bulbs on the ceiling. I thought the show was amazing, recalled Kim Thale of Soundgarden. They did a cover of the Velvet Underground's Here She Comes Now that I thought was brilliant. And then, when I heard Lithium, it stuck in my mind. Ben, our bass player, came up to me and said, "That's the hit. That's a top 40 hit right there." The A&R men were just as impressed. As the set ended, after a break for a fire alarm, Jeff Finster of Charisma Records managed to convince the band his label was the best choice. 2 days later, Nirvana's lawyer Alan Mintz called and said the band was going to sign with Charisma. The deal was for $200,000, a healthy but not outrageous advance. But before Finster could have a contract prepared, the band decided at the last minute to sign instead with DGC, an imprint of Geffen Records. Though DGC's A&R rep, Gary Gersh, had not been one of the early bidders, the endorsement of Sonic Youth ultimately proved to be the deciding factor. Geffen also had a strong promotion department, headed by Mark Cates, and Golden Mountain knew promotion was the key to breaking the band. The Geffen deal called for Nirvana to be paid $287,000, at the time one of the largest advances for a Northwest band. Mintz extricated the band from the vestiges of their Sub Pop contract. As part of the Geffen agreement, Sub Pop would be paid $75,000 and get 2% of sales from the next 2 albums. Though Kurt had read music industry books, even he wasn't prepared for how long the deal took to be finalized. The contract wasn't signed until April, and how little money it initially meant for him. By the time fees for lawyers, managers, taxes, and debt were deducted, Gold Mountain put him on a retainer of $1,000 per month. He immediately got behind on his bills and complained he could only afford corn dogs. The floor of the apartment was now littered with their sticks. Grohl had gone back east for most of December, and minus his roommate, Kurt sought to relieve his boredom by any means necessary. He hung out a lot with Dylan, and soon broke another barrier he had sworn never to cross. Dylan was a gun nut, and Kurt consistently preached that guns were barbaric. A few times Kurt agreed to go into the woods with Dylan, but he wouldn't touch the guns, and on one occasion even refused to leave the car. But eventually, Kurt began to let Dylan show him how to aim and fire. It was harmless stuff, putting holes in cans with shotguns, or shooting up art projects Kurt had decided to sacrifice. Kurt also began to hang out a lot with Mikey Nelson to shop at thrift stores. There was always some record he was hoping to track down, said Nelson. One of his favorites had a bunch of truckers talking over the CB radio. He had the Charles Manson record Lie, and he was a huge fan of H.R. Pufnstuf. Even in late 1990, Kurt was still pushing the merits of the Knack's Get the Knack. He told me all the great songs on that record were the ones people hadn't heard of. John Perky stopped by the apartment that month and helped Kurt shop for Christmas presents. Kurt's biggest purchase that year was a large custom aquarium for his turtles. They smoked marijuana before shopping, but Perky was surprised when Kurt asked, "Do you know where I can get some heroin?" Perky replied, "You're not shooting up, are you?" "Oh no," Kurt lied. "I'll just smoke anything." In many ways, his meager budget helped curb his addictive desires. He simply couldn't afford to be a drug addict. On December 11th, Kurt again sought medical help for his stomach condition, seeing a doctor in Tacoma. This time, the diagnosis was irritable bowel syndrome, and Kurt was prescribed Lidox. The drug didn't seem to help his pain, and he discontinued it 2 weeks later when he got bronchitis. The year ended with a New Year's Eve show in Portland. Slim traveled down with the band and saw what he remembered as a knockout show, despite the fact that Kurt was drunk on whiskey and coke against his doctor's orders. It was now noticeable that Kurt was attracting groupies. Slim watched one young woman locking eyes on him for the whole show. Her demeanor said, "I'm the girl in the audience who wants to you tonight." Kurt, however, didn't notice, and like most nights, went home alone. They began 1991 with a 3-hour late night drive from Portland, since they had a studio session scheduled the next day. They finished 2 songs, Aneurysm and a re-recording of Even in His Youth. They also worked up several songs Kurt had just written, including an early All Apologies. They had a bunch of ideas they wanted to throw down, remembered Craig Montgomery, who produced the tracks, but their gear was in horrible shape, and they were all pretty fried. Kurt's friend Jesse Reed returned to the Northwest for the holiday, and the day after the recording session, they went to Aberdeen to visit Jesse's parents. On the drive, Kurt found himself talking about his future with his old friend, and as the car entered Grays Harbor County, he admitted his love for this landscape and the people, contradicting everything he said in interviews. As they passed some of the farms outside of Satsop, an idyllic valley despite an abandoned nuclear plant, Kurt told Jesse his dream was to use his label Advance to buy a farm. He saw a large ranch house and pointed to it. "What do you think of that house over there? If I buy that, then we can play as loud as we want, have big parties, have people over, and no one will care." The house wasn't for sale, and Kurt had no money. Yet. But he swore to Jesse that if he ever did hit the big time, he'd come back to the harbor and buy a ranch, just like Neil Young has in California. Early in 1991, Kurt made a telephone call he had been putting off for years. He phoned his father. Since moving to Olympia, most of his contact with Dawn had been through his grandparents. The conversation, as was typical of communication between 2 stoic Cobain men, was short. Kurt mostly talked about the band, telling Dawn he had signed a major label deal. Dawn wasn't sure what that meant, but when he asked Kurt if he had enough money, his son said yes. Kurt inquired of Dawn's other children, and they briefly chatted about Dawn's latest job, working as an investigator with the Washington State Patrol. Kurt told his father that he had been performing a lot. Dawn said he'd enjoy going to see him sometime. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, and was remarkable more for what the 2 men didn't say than what they did. Dawn wasn't able to talk about the hurt he had felt when his firstborn had drifted away, and Kurt wasn't able to talk about any of the hurts he had felt, not the divorce, nor the remarriage, or their many other struggles. Kurt had stayed in better touch with his mother. Her interest in his career and her acceptance of him as a musician seemed to increase as his fame did. Kurt and Wendy were drawn closer yet that year when another family tragedy struck. On January 2nd, 1991, Wendy's brother Patrick died of AIDS in California at 46. Kurt was invited to the memorial ceremony, but he did not attend, citing his need to work on his upcoming album. For once, Kurt wasn't lying to get out of a family commitment. He was indeed preparing for his album, and as 1991 began, he was fastidiously working. Nirvana had rented a new practice spot in Tacoma, and every day they rehearsed for hours. Some of their playing was to teach Grohl the songs in their catalog, but much of it was owning new material Kurt was writing. In January, Sub Pop released their last official Nirvana single, a live recording of the Vaselines' Molly's Lips. In the run-on groove, the label had etched a one-word farewell. Later. In February, Kurt turned 24, and for the occasion, he sat down and began to write the story of his life. One of dozens of short attempts he undertook over the years. This version ran 3 pages before petering out. "Hi, I'm 24 years old," he wrote. "I was born a white, lower-middle-class male off the coast of Washington State. My parents owned a compact stereo component system molded in stimulated wood grain, and a 4-record box set featuring AM radio's contemporary hits of the early 70s called Good Vibrations by Ronco. It had such hits as Tony Orlando and Dawn's Tie a Yellow Ribbon, and Jim Croce's Time in a Bottle. After years of my begging, they finally bought me a 10-drum set with paper heads out of the back of a Sears catalog. Within the first week, my sister poked holes in the heads with a screwdriver. Kurt's history went on to note that he remembered his mother playing Chicago songs on the piano, and that he'd be forever grateful to his Aunt Mary for giving him 3 Beatles albums. He wrote that one of his first disappointments was when he found out in 1976 that the Beatles had dissolved 6 years earlier. His parents' divorce seemed to have less of an effect. My parents got a divorce, so I moved in with my dad into a trailer park in an even smaller logging community. My dad's friends talked him into joining the Columbia Record Club, and soon records showed up in my trailer once a week, accumulating quite a large collection. And with that, this attempt at telling his life story ended. He went back to his favorite journal subject at the time, writing linear notes for the upcoming album. He wrote many different versions. The album ultimately didn't include any, but one draft of a dedication for the record said more about his childhood than his attempt at biography. Thanks to unencouraging parents everywhere, he wrote, for giving their children the will to show them up. In March, Nirvana played a 4-day Canadian tour, and then immediately went back into rehearsals. After much debate with their managers and label bosses, they settled on Butch Vig, again as producer, using Sound City, a studio outside of Los Angeles. The label would be picking up the expenses, though they would come out in Nirvana's advance. Before they headed for California, the band had one more Seattle show on April 17th at the OK Hotel. Kurt organized it after hearing his friend Mikey Nelson had so many unpaid traffic citations he was in danger of going to jail. The lineup included Bikini Kill and Fits of Depression, and Kurt insisted all proceeds go to Nelson. The show did not completely sell out, owing to a party for the movie singles the same night. Nirvana's set included covers of Devo's Turnaround, The Troggs' Wild Thing, and the Wipers' D7, but the surprise came when the band played a new composition. Kurt slurred the vocals, perhaps not even knowing all the words, but the guitar part was already in place, as was the tremendous driving drum beat. I didn't know what they were playing, recalled Susie Tennant, DGC's promotion rep, but I knew it was amazing. I remember jumping up and down and asking everyone next to me, "What is this song?" Tennant's words mimic what Novoselic and Grohl had said just 3 weeks earlier, when Kurt brought a new riff into rehearsal. "It's called Smells Like Teen Spirit," Kurt announced to his bandmates, stealing the Kathleen Hanna graffiti. At the time, no one in the band knew of the deodorant, and it wasn't until the song was recorded and mastered that anyone pointed out it had the name of a product on it. When Kurt first brought that song into the studio, it had a faster beat and less focus on the bridge. Kurt was playing just the chorus, Chris remembered. It was Chris' idea to slow the tune down, and Grohl instinctively added a powerful beat. At the OK Hotel, Kurt just hummed a couple of the verses. He was changing the lyrics to all his songs during this period, and Teen Spirit had about a dozen drafts. One of the first drafts featured the chorus, "A denial and from strangers, a revival and from favors. Here we are now, we're so famous, we're so stupid and from Vegas." Another began with, "Come out and play, make up the rules, have lots of fun, we know we'll lose." Later in the same version, with a line that had no rhyming couplet, "The finest day I ever had was when tomorrow never came." A week later, the band headed to Los Angeles. On the drive down, Kurt stopped by Universal Studios and went on the same rides he had taken with his grandparents 15 years before. The group moved into the Oakwood apartments for the next 6 weeks, not far from Sound City Studios. Vig visited them during pre-production and found chaos. There was graffiti on the walls, he remembered, and the couches were upside down. They would stay up every night and go down to Venice Beach until 6 in the morning. The nervousness the band felt about recording was alleviated by drinking, which all three members did to excess. One night, Chris was arrested for driving while intoxicated. John Silva had to scramble to bail him out and get him back in the studio. Most of the sessions began at 3 in the afternoon and ran until midnight. During breaks, Kurt wandered the halls of the studio and stared at gold records for albums like Fleetwood Mac's Rumors and Tom Petty's Damn the Torpedoes, though he was most impressed by the Evel Knievel record cut there. The light metal band Warrant had rented the studio before Nirvana. When the group came back to pick up gear during Nirvana's session, Kurt grabbed the studio's paging system and started screaming, "Bring me some cherry pie!" the title of Warrant's hit. One night, Kurt sold the original master tapes to the Evel Knievel album and took them home to Olympia. They spent that first week trying to get the basic tracks down, mostly concentrating on the drum sound, which was Vig's specialty. After 2 weeks, they had laid down 10 songs, though most had no more than 3 takes, because Kurt's voice would wear out after so much screaming. Many of the songs were ones they cut previously during the Smart Studio sessions, and it was more technical work than creative. Compared to the band's other sessions, there were few problems. During the recording of Lithium, Kurt struggled to get his guitar parts right and became progressively more frustrated, eventually smashing his guitar on the studio floor. In the end, Vig decided to use the take recorded during Kurt's meltdown. It was titled Endless, Nameless, and put on the compact disc as a hidden track. The biggest problem of the session was Kurt's own procrastination. He still hadn't settled on lyrics for many of his songs. Though a few tunes like Polly and Breed, the band had been playing for years. When he did finish a lyric, most were as paradoxical as they were revelatory. Many lines left the listener unclear as to whether he was singing about external or internal circumstances, defying explanation through communicating an emotional tone. In his journals, Kurt wrote a letter to the long-dead critic Lester Bangs, complaining about the state of rock journalism, a profession that both fascinated and repulsed him, by asking, why in the did journalists insist on coming up with a second-rate Freudian evaluation of my lyrics when 90% of the time they've transcribed them incorrectly? Despite the wisdom in Kurt's question, he spent hours trying to figure out the songs of his idols. He also labored over his own compositions, variably inserting messages or editing himself when he thought he had been too revealing. Such was the case with Something in the Way, the last song recorded during the sessions. The lyrics recounted Kurt's mythical period living under the bridge. He had written this song a year earlier, but he had kept it hidden from his bandmates. In the first imagining of the album, Kurt had wanted a girl side composed of all the songs about Toby, and a boy side to include Sliver, Sappy, and Polly, among others, all the songs about his family or his inner world. He had always planned to end the album with Something in the Way, though he never mentioned this to his producer. Instead, he brought forth the song during the Sound City sessions as a last-minute surprise, and wrote the lyrics out in the studio, making it appear to all as if he were crafting them on the spot when he had worked on them for years. Despite his letter to Lester Bangs, no single individual analyzed the Freudian implications of his lyrics more than Kurt himself, and he knew very well that releasing a song implying he lived under a bridge would cause much pain for his family. As they finished up the sessions, a friend of Grohl's visited and offered to bet Kurt that he'd be on the cover of Rolling Stone within 6 months. Kurt replied, forget it. Mikey Nelson and his bandmates from Fits of Depression also showed up and stayed with Nirvana at the Oakwood, as did the Melvins. During one weekend, there were 22 people sleeping in the 2-bedroom apartment. The Fits had run into more bad luck. A club had promised a much-needed show, but canceled at the last minute. Call him back, Kurt insisted, and tell him we'll play too. 2 days after finishing their record, Nirvana played a tiny Los Angeles club called Jabberjaw and debuted On a Plane and Come As You Are in front of an astonished audience. They insisted that all the door money go to Nelson. Kurt described the show in a letter to Toby as an indescribably up on booze and drugs, out of tune, and rather, sloppy. It took me over 15 minutes to change my guitar string while people heckled me and called me drunk. After the show, I ran outside and vomited. At the club, Kurt noticed Iggy Pop in the audience, and this time, Kurt wasn't wearing an embarrassing shirt. It was probably the most flattering moment of my life, he observed. Yet the most revealing part of Kurt's letter was his admission of increasing drug abuse, including Quaaludes, which he had been ingesting like candy. "I've been taking a lot of drugs lately," he wrote Toby. "It might be time for the Betty Ford Clinic or the Richard Nixon Library to save me from abusing my anemic rodent-like body any longer. I can't wait to be back home, wherever that is, in bed, neurotic and malnourished, and complaining how the weather sucks, and it's the whole reason for my misery. I miss you, Bikini Kill. I totally love you." He signed it K-U-R-D-T. This letter, like so many others he wrote, went unsent, perhaps because of a woman he had run into 2 weeks before the Jabberjaw show. She would play a far larger role in his life than Betty Ford, Richard Nixon, or Toby Vale. He remembered her from her small part in Straight to Hell. Well, that's the end of Chapter 13. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 13 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.